I'm going to introduce our two fabulous guests, Jane Latimer and Lisa Sherrill, who have been presenters and volunteers and part of this community, just some beautiful people. Jane Latimer, MA, is a psychedelic integration specialist with over 40 years experience working with individuals with developmental trauma. Through her educational program, she trains individuals and therapists in best use practices for healing personal and collective trauma. She teaches an array of transformational models that, when combined with transpersonal states and psychedelics, can potentiate healing and spiritual collective evolution. Lisa Sherrill, MA, PhD candidate, is a family therapist, executive leadership coach, mediator, and psychedelic integration specialist with over 15 years experience working with individuals, couples, businesses, and groups, dealing with gridlock, conflict, and trauma. Lisa's specialty is in the intersecting fields of attachment theory, neurobiology, addiction recovery, archetypal psychology, cultural trauma recovery, and Lisa is a doctorate candidate of somatic psychology. Welcome, Lisa and Jane.
Actually, you wanted me to talk a little bit more about who we are. So I'm probably one of the elders here on the call, and I've been doing self-development work as soon as I woke up out of denial, out of my major eating disorder in my 20s, and had a spiritual awakening in my 20s as well. So I have been on this path for maybe 5 decades now, and so incrementally working on many different levels of the developmental trauma that I was experiencing. And of course, we didn't know and didn't have that name back then for what it was. So I was going through. And the only reason I'm bringing that up is because it really wasn't until almost 4 or 5 years ago that I came upon, through the use of psychedelics, I began to understand the relationship of our soul, of my soul, and its trajectory through my soul's own, quote, lifetimes or dimensional realities that had a huge impact on who I was as a personality or a persona with the traumas that I came into this life with. So up until that point, I had been dealing with everything that we knew that was possible to know through the decades, through the years, from the biographical standpoint. But it really wasn't until more recently that I began to expand out beyond that. And that's when I saw how crucial it was to bring this element into the healing, because it gave me a whole other, not only viewpoint, but it gave me access to a healing that wasn't possible before then. And then I reconnected with Lisa. We had known each other through another healing modality a decade or so ago, and went different ways, and then came back together. And I found out that she was actually working in a similar way. So Lisa, tell a little bit about you and this topic.
Yeah, okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jane. I think my story is a little similar. So I did an immense amount of healing, developmental healing, working on an immense amount of trauma, but I recognized there was almost a limit to how far I could go without bringing in the soul piece. And when I brought in sort of that limitless, infinite, kind of expanded possibility that is the soul, then it expanded my capacity for growth. It expanded my capacity to see into things, look at things from multiple dimensions. And when I'm able to embody that, then working on trauma, looking at things of healing, just take on a whole new world. Healing trauma becomes a part of the process as opposed to the process. And there's something bigger that begins to take shape, and there's a bigger purpose that shows up, and I feel a bigger part of a community, an expanded part of a global or universal sense, and I become embedded within that when I own the soul and I embody the soul. And then trauma becomes a part healing the trauma becomes a part of that, as opposed to my life, which was what it was before. It was just my life, and it was just, all I could see was one trauma that I had to work through after another, and it was endless. And it's like, is this the point of life? Is this what I'm going to do for the rest of my life? So soul embodied for me, just really the name speaks to what I feel like Jane and I are talking about. It's about embodying something bigger than our trauma, something bigger than ourselves, something bigger than even our families and our communities. There's something bigger, way more infinite. And if we can tap into that, if we can access that, then the capacity for our growth and our capacity for our self-authorship becomes so much more bigger. And it stops being about trying to fix something, and instead becomes about beginning to taste life and own life and harness life and move life forward. So I think that's kind of been my trajectory, is sort of after a while hitting my head up against a wall, working on my trauma and needing to open another door to feel more complete and whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So to add to that perspective, the perspective shifted for me when I realized that the trauma I was working on in this biographical system was actually deeply connected to my purpose for being here. But I couldn't understand my purpose for being here without having had the weirder experiences, or the experiences that Groff would term the transpersonal experiences, and the experiences that we get on medicines. And I found that, so it's like, what I discovered was that as my first of all, I want to make a distinction between spirit and soul. And Lisa, I don't know that you and I have talked about this topic many, many times, but I don't think that we ever really talked about the distinction. And I think when I hear you talk about it, I get that you have a different framework around it than I do. So basically, Lisa and I are having a conversation, and you guys are all sort of getting to peer in and into what we might talk about. But when I say spirit, I am talking about the source energy. So I'm talking about, when I say soul, I am actually talking about my own, there's an identity connected to soul. So it's not the same thing as source. So I just wanted to make that distinction, that my soul journey is different than Lisa's soul journey, although, and different from each of your soul journeys, although we're all connected at the most basic foundational level as source or spirit, the one. But that what I became aware of is that, because I had experience, a source awakening, a spiritual awakening in my 20s, and that was very much a connection to spirit. It was a connection to an awakening to this huge dimensional love and beingness that was the oneness of everything. And yet that awakening to my own personal soul journey was a separate awakening, and it happened just, five or so years ago. So it was a very, very different kind of awakening. But what that soul awakening became about is it gave me access to what in shamanism we would call soul fragments or soul pieces. So I became aware that as a soul, when I came in and incarnated in this lifetime, that I had actually left parts of my soul, not only in little parts of my biographical life, like my younger self, my infant self, those pieces, but I had also left aspects of my soul in other dimensions, in other lifetimes, in other galaxies. And it would sound strange, and of course it sounds strange to the Western mind, but the impact that had is that I was able to retrieve aspects of myself that didn't even incarnate, so that there was no possibility of retrieving those parts in this biographical lifetime. So it wasn't until I was able to get past and see the trajectory of the soul through time and space that I was able to begin to retrieve other types of soul fragments and bring them back in. So that's the first thing I wanted to say, and I'll leave it at that. So that the idea is that I guess one of the first things we said was why working on your own developmental trauma is not enough. And I think I just explained that there's only so much we can do on in the nervous system. So the ways that Western psychology is dealing with this, so which when we think of internal family systems, exiles, for example, mostly people talk about that in terms of the biographical human being has exiles left in different places in this lifetime. We don't really hear very much about the exiles that are never even incarnated. So that's one of the pieces that I wanted to bring in. And that when we're working with trauma in the nervous system, so somatically, my question was always, so I get to calm down or I get to become more resilient. And Lisa, I'm sure you're going to have a lot more to say about this, but for what purpose? So is for me, the purpose of then being able to be calmer and peaceful wasn't enough. So for me, my soul, my lessons, I needed something more. It's not for everybody. So everybody else may be different, maybe just perfectly what you need. And maybe just what you're reaching for is to find more resilience, more calmness, more peace in your life. And that's it. That's perfectly good. But for me, that wasn't enough. And so I needed to start looking in other places to find it. What do you think, Lisa?
I want to kind of add a different flavor to what you're saying. I want to kind of come back to soul peace. So I like James Hillman's exploration around soul, and I like the definition that soul is more like a mediator. So it mediates between spirit and the material world. And so through the soul, we can access, right, the source energy and divinity and that infinite nature. And it also allows us to access Gaia and the material world. And it's kind of this facilitator, the mediator. And so when we lose that sense of the soul, we actually lose touch with Gaia. We lose touch with the material world. And we kind of become numb to it. We objectify. We also lose touch with our capacity for self-authorship and that infinite nature. So the soul, I feel like, is just such it's the impetus. It's what needs to be in order for us to really get something bigger. So that's how I would define it, or at least how I define it is how I feel it inside of my body, as almost like it binds me, or it supports the binding between spirit and the material world in some ways. Mm-hmm. I can't remember what you were talking about after that.
I went on too long, too many things in.
We can either keep moving on, or you can throw me a nugget, a kernel, and it'll jog my memory, and then I'll go off.
Are there any questions in the chat, Donna, around this particular topic so far?
No, not about this topic, but I encourage people as we go along. Okay, we've got one from Miranda. If we lose certain parts of our soul fragments, is this something we should retrieve? What if they were supposed to stay in our other dimensions / worlds?
That's a juicy question.
Yeah.
Do you want to attempt that, or should I?
Go ahead.
Okay. I don't think that there's a supposed to, and I think that's going to be a case-by-case basis. So the one thing that I found out in my very limited perspective, is that so typically we would ask a shaman to do our soul retrieval, and that's typically the way it would be in more indigenous cultures, right? And still in 21st century shamanism, the work of Michael Harner, still the shaman is taught to do the soul retrieval for us. But if we don't become skilled in that particular method of retrieving soul, then the other thing we have to ask is, well, how do we get our soul parts back? So the model that I tend to use more is the model of that when we have prepared the physical vehicle enough and it to be able to house, when the soul part is ready to come in, it will not come in until it's a friendly place to come into. And that's my sense of why we need to do all the physical, the developmental work, the nervous system work, the understanding of the skills that we missed in childhood, so that we can reincorporate those skills into our life, where we have some sense that our growth, where we got stuck in our growth potential, and we can begin to incorporate that. We learn how to ask for our needs to be met, right? No soul part is going to come back into us if we don't know how to get their needs met. So my experience of that is that when I'm ready, and if on medicine, I'm shown by my inner guidance system that there is a soul part that wants to come in, and I'll be shown where it's coming from. If that's information I need to have, then it will come back. So I don't hold the perspective that there is a right way, and I don't hold the perspective that all the soul parts should come back. I'm just offering up that if they are meant to come back, that we allow them to come back. And our job is to do the preparation work inside of our own physical body systems, vehicles, to make it comfortable and make it safe for any of the soul parts to come back that may want to come back.
Great answer, Jane. So we can stay on this topic, or we can move to the next, which sort of just dovetails on what you're talking about. So how conception in utero and birth trauma impact the incoming soul.
Go for it, Lisa.
Okay. So when we are a little fetus, I guess this is just a little 101 lesson on womb trauma. So when first trimester, second trimester, third trimester, when we're a little fetus in our mama's belly, we feel her stress. Because our nervous system is just developing, because we don't have that fight, flight, defense response, that online, we are very susceptible to being traumatized within the womb. Okay, so again, so what happens is the nervous system, the only defense that's really online when we're a fetus in our mom's belly, when we perceive a sense of threat inside the womb, is to freeze and to dissociate. Those are the two strategies that the fetus does. So in that freezing, it's a shutdown. It's a dorsal vagal shutdown response. Okay. Then there's the dissociative response. And there's some theories that suggest when you dissociate, you move into an altered state, and it's an attempt at the soul leaving, okay. Kind of an exit strategy. And so when I do art processes with individuals with their womb trauma, you'll often see, so I get them to draw what it was like for a fetus inside a womb where mama was really stressed for whatever reason, or the family dynamic was just a lot of gridlock and a lot of stress, a lot of trauma, or just cultural conditionings. Maybe you grew up in a pretty healthy home, but we're in a North American society where just the society, the social conditionings, the cultural conditionings are such that it creates such impingement and constraints on the organism that itself can create sort of this imprisonment for mom and dad, which induces the stress for the fetus. Or you can have what's referred to as inherited trauma, right? Healthy home, however, mom's carrying trauma from her parents and parents, or the father, and that the father's sperm can hold trauma. And so then that gets embedded within the fetus. So there's all the different sorts of ways in which this poor fetus growing up can begin to hold trauma. And in that, what happens is when I do art processes, I get people to kind of draw out through art what that was like for the fetus to be in that dorsal vagal shutdown freeze response, and then what it was like to actually move into that dissociative state. And often what shows up is it's an attempt for the soul to go back to source, is what often shows up within those diagrams, within the pictures, because it's just too painful to be in this human experience, this human body on this human planet. So I don't even know if I'm going off tangent. Maybe not. Question is, yeah, impacts the oncoming soul. So that's
You're not. You're right on.
Right. So yeah, thank you, Donna. So this is one example of how the incoming soul gets impacted. And so a lot of people, and Jane, you and I have talked about this, is a lot of people will say, I don't feel like I'm halfway on this planet and halfway out. I want to commit suicide. I don't want to be here. I just feel like I want to get off this planet. And there are many reasons that that can happen, but one of them is when you're in being incubated inside this womb and you're in a dorsal vagal sort of freeze shutdown response, you're dissociated, you are halfway out. You've already gotten halfway down your exit strategy. You have tried to escape. And until that soul can come back into the body and feel safe in the body, feel safe in its surrounding environment, then it is going to feel like the soul is being impacted. It doesn't know where it belongs. Does it need to go back home to source, to that secure base? Or can it create something here? And so it stays sort of in this limbo, never quite feeling settled here or there. Jane?
Right. Yeah. So I would just add to that, Lisa, that so that's exactly what I was referring to from the other end, right? Where parts of ourselves don't even incarnate. And I think, Lisa, you just gave the perfect example of why that might happen. I think it's also interesting as you're talking. So we tend to think of the soul as being one piece, and the way you're talking about it is like one soul coming in, right? And the fetus is frozen, so there's no place for it to come. And I just want to break that down a little, because what can happen is that part of us can come in. So a part of us, well, has to come in, otherwise we wouldn't be alive here. And somehow we manage to go through our life with a part of our soul here. And then we might take baby steps. So this is like what we're talking about in terms of the healing of this human vehicle. And as we heal parts, as we heal certain aspects of our humanity, then new aspects of our soul can come in. And so that it might not be to think about all or nothing, but might happen in stages or in parts. So for example, I did a lot of work for many, many years that prepared me. And by the way, in my particular practice in my school, I probably put people through more prep work than anybody I know. And the reason is what I'm just about to describe. I had done decades of work, but it really wasn't until my first MDMA journey when there was an aspect of my soul that landed inside of my body that I didn't even know had existed before then. But it was only an aspect. So it enabled me to then all of a sudden inhabit a place of belonging inside my body. But really, when I look back on it, and it was a very, very important aspect, but it was still only partial. It's almost as if, well, that part had to happen first to make it safe enough for the next part. And so then when I went back in some future journeys, for example, it's when, or even on mini microdoses of medicines, then I was shown the next step and then the next step. So a microdose of something might then, because I had been so opened up and that first step was so complete, then I could take the next little piece that I saw where it was trapped and I could invite it back in. So it was an ongoing process, let's put it that way. But this first, I think the key to what, Lisa, you're talking about is that it is the part that we're most unaware of, because it's so young, it's in every single cell of our body. And it feels as if it's who we are. It is who we are. It's actually who we become as we're growing older, because we become that merging with our negative environment, or the merging with the negative conditioning.
Yeah, if I can just launch on what you just said with that negative environment. So there's two things I want to share here is, so yeah, so you're dissociated the only strategy you have inside the womb is to dissociate. And then you become a vessel to take on the negative environment around you. So it's like you're pushing out the soul, the individuality, the who you are, and what's coming in to replace it is the cultural conditioning, is more the compliance with the status quo on the outside. And so, and as Jane suggested, it's almost like you have to clear all that out to make room for the soul. Once the soul exits, you become a vessel for something else. Yeah. And you'll see, like in Jane, again, you and I talk about how in tribal communities, everything is about soul. The whole thing, the pregnancy, birth, everything, that the whole community embeds soul through rituals, through dance, through everything. There's a component of soul in it all. And so then the child creates space within themselves, there's space within the community, there's space within the families for the soul to be there. The individuality, uniqueness, everything is seen with soul. And that's lost within our culture, right? And so then we have the dissociation, and what is within our culture gets replaced.
Right, and so that's why. So I don't know how many people here saw the presentation last month, but it was on models of transformation. And the point being is that, so in our culture, we're not starting from that. We have to do the undoing first. And we're not starting from the place where the rightful place of the soul inhabiting our bodies to then be expressed in our world, what we're actually working with when we start embarking on, especially for those of us who are embarking on healing through psychedelic journeys, we're actually going through the great unraveling and dissolving of everything that we thought we were or we should have been, because we've taken on all sorts of personas in the way. And if we don't have that understanding when we go in, especially if we're beginning on the psychedelic journey, we don't have that understanding that there has to be a great undoing of what we call the cultural trance that gets embedded in our very cells in this time and place, but also ancestrally. We get a great shock. So we come in, we can have an opening, but if we don't understand what is involved in actually the process of dissolution or dissolving of those structures, it could be shocking, and our worlds can be turned upside down. I actually want to say it's like we have to approach this work from the two ends. Like we're approaching it from opening the crack, seeing through the defenses and being opened up enough to see that there's something greater, and following that greater place, which then comes through us as our internal guidance system. And at the same time, we need to be working on this very practical life that was created out of, for lack of a kinder word, a lie. So we've created a life built on a lie, on somebody else's conditioning that we've taken in through the fetus, through the birth process, and we have to begin dissolving that. And so there's this coming together that has to be done very, I feel like with great respect for what each of us can handle as we go through that process.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, just one more thing before we move on. So again, I'm just going to kind of share what Jane shares, but just in a different kind of wording. Is, again, if you get in tribal communities and there's trauma that happens because of they're not embedded within this cultural trance, because their soul embedded within the families, within the communities, within themselves, they can absorb that trauma, they can contain it, they have the capacity to bounce back from it with a lot more resiliency. Okay? But then you try to resolve trauma at the individual level within our North American society, and it's like, why does it never end? Why is this so hard? It's because we don't, within our culture, we don't within our families, within our community, have soul, right? It's the void of soul, we don't know how to work with trauma. And so when we work through the trauma and then we look on the outside, all we see on the outside is more trauma. Like the system is all completely traumatized. It's a broken system. And so there's two things that are happening. And one thing is when we start to fall apart, it's because, like Jane says, we've created a life that's based on a lie. And also part of the falling apart is because our system is broken. And the part of the kind of alchemy and the transformation is to support a transformation in our own system, in the reality on the outside. So there's kind of two things happening.
So actually you said a really important thing, Lisa, which is that to bring in the collective. So we cannot go on this personal journey without, I mean, we do, because while we're still encapsulated egos, we do think it's our own personal journey, but really at some point, when that dissolves enough, we begin to realize that this is a cultural journey and we can't do it alone. So we need each other. And it's a collective healing. It's a collective experience. So everything that we do in Psyalchemy in my program is always for the collective. Every piece of personal work is for the collective, for all beings, especially our own traumatized ancestral lineages. And it has to be that way. It can't be individual. But it comes in, it starts very individualized.
Yeah, thanks for throwing that piece in, Jane.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we come in as individualists, but it isn't. And oftentimes alone, because psychedelic work is so esoteric, even though it's spreading, but it really is the community and the group.
Well, it starts like, so most people who come to me, I've read Michael Pollan's book and, and this is in no way to minimize that, because we all start somewhere and we have to start somewhere. But we start with, there's a personal problem, which is I'm depressed or I'm anxious or whatever, however, or I'm having trouble with relationships. And that's the beauty, that's the sacredness of those wounds, because those wounds are driving us and compelling us towards the healing of that. And so all the doorways that we come in on are going to take us to a place where this isn't really about us. And that's when the work gets really interesting, because I also see a lot, Lisa, you probably do this too, right? Where we're looking for when is the end of the journey going to happen and when I'm going to be happy, because that's part of our trance, is that we've tranced into that we're going to be able to fix this and we're going to get happy in the end. And that isn't actually what happens. What actually happens is that the healing gets deeper. It gets harder. Because then we start working on just the personal and we start working for all beings, and it's a whole other level of healing. So it's the journey. The journey is that. And then there's another interesting piece that I really want to put in, and I don't know where it fits in our outline, but I'm going to say it because it's coming through me now. That there's something, it's what we call that inner guidance system, but there's something that's driving us. And it's been driving us through our whole life. It's been driving us through the hardest, darkest times that we've had, the deepest challenges. Even for those of us who aren't able yet to distinguish that or find it or know it, it's still there and it's still driving us. And so part of the great awakening of this soul is as we become more awake to that internal guidance. It's always been there, in there in the darkest, hardest times. So there's that element of that soul, Lisa, that you're talking about coming into that fetus, that somehow that wisdom or that connection to that place is in us. no matter how frozen our bodies become because of our inherited traumas, that piece is always there, and it's driving the healing for ourselves and the whole lineage. And as we learn to recognize and distinguish that inner guidance system, which of course is part of the holotropic model and part of Stan Grof's amazing contribution, it's just like one small part of his amazing contribution to this field. As you become more aware of that, as that gets bigger and bigger, that's where our greatest awareness of who we are, why we're here, why we took on the traumas that we took on, start to really begin to make sense. And that's the juicy part for me.
Absolutely. Nathan has a question, Jane. Besides trauma, is there any impact on the soul from inherited positive or ecstatic experiences?
Oh. Well, that's an interesting question.
Mm-hmm.
I never thought of that before. Thank you, Nathan. So ask that question again, because I think that I'm curious about specifically, I think I understand what you're meaning, Nathan. So ask it again.
So besides trauma, is there any impact on the soul from inherited positive or ecstatic experiences?
Jane, I'd like to, let me launch and then you can launch in.
Yeah. Can I just say one quick, I'm going to say one sentence and then you do it. So the only thing I want to say about that is that, okay, no, go ahead, Lisa. Go ahead, because I'll remember what I was going to say. Go ahead.
So impact on the soul from inherited positive. So, okay, I want to go back and discuss what exactly trauma is. So you can win the lottery and have an extremely positive experience, winning the lottery, for example. And it takes the system out of its state of ordinary into something that's so extraordinary, right? That it overwhelms the nervous system and causes the nervous. And then there is that pent up charge, that pent up sympathetic charge inside the nervous system that gets trapped and then traumatizes the nervous system. So people who win the lottery, we know about 80% of them lose all their money within 2 years. There's a reason for that. Their nervous system does not have big enough capacity to hold that kind of change. It's too stressful. We went from ordinary to out of the ordinary, completely out of the ordinary, and the system was like, I can't keep up with that. So whether your experience is perceived or judged as negative or perceived or judged as positive, it doesn't matter. It's just how far outside of the ordinary state in which you live in can your system tolerate. Okay. Yes, it's going to have an impact on the soul if the system can't handle the charge. Okay.
Love that, Lisa. That was a brilliant answer.
Okay. So an out of the ordinary, like you can have an explosive psychedelic experience and it can be incredibly traumatizing to the nervous system.
So you're basically, what you're saying is really what is trauma. So we're associating trauma with something bad happened to us versus trauma as a shock to the system.
Yep.
And the only other thing I want to add to that, which is what I was going to say, is I don't think that it impacts the soul. That's not what gets impacted. What is impacted is what Lisa's just talking about, is the body's capacity to hold or contain the light, the truth of who we are. Yeah. The truth of who we are is the truth of who we are. That will never get impacted. What gets impacted is our capacity to accept that, allow that, and live that. And that's through this physical body.
Did you want to add to that, Lisa?
I'm not sure. I'm like holding my tongue. So we'll move on. And
You don't have to hold your tongue.
Yes.
Go for it.
Well, Jane, I guess again, we're talking about the soul being this multidimensional kind of abstract concept, and so it's like, okay, a big part of the soul is like self-authorship and purpose, right? So we know that trauma, positive events, negative events, anything that overwhelms the nervous system is going to, in some ways, cause the soul to fragment. So it does, in some ways, impact the soul, and it can help deepen the soul. Like as we repair that, right, the soul goes deeper. The soul matures in suffering. The soul matures in those, like in those elements of getting into, as you call it, the muck, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I guess that's where I was thinking.
Yeah.
And
no, you're right. You're right. You're absolutely right. I agree with you.
Okay.
So in that respect, yeah, the soul is definitely impacted by the traumatic event, in that it can fragment it or cause it to leave, or right. You're absolutely right about that. And I think the way I was thinking of that when I said that was that it's not going to tarnish the soul. So our soul is always our soul. It's a matter of how we retrieve it, or bringing it back and allowing it to be whole within ourselves. But that's what I think I was meaning.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm not sure that the soul doesn't get tarnished in the way our lives get tarnished.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's an element to the soul where it just likes that. It likes that kind of gunk and
The grittiness.
Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't like a polished life. It doesn't want a polished life.
The humanity. John, did you have a question? You can unmute yourself and ask it.
I'll just read what I wrote. What about trauma that's imposed by the culture as we live our lives? We've spoken about prenatal, perinatal, birth trauma, etc. For example, I've watched extremely talented and joyful people beaten into submission by joining corporate America. And I've almost literally watched pieces of their souls chipped away by the capitalist ethic that we all live within. And it's actually happened to me personally, feeling chunks of that falling off as I'm bending to the will of my masters, as it were. Can you speak to that?
Well, I would love to speak to that. I'm sure Lisa would too.
Yeah.
So who's going to go first?
I don't know.
You go ahead, because I would love to go first. So go ahead.
Okay. Well, yeah. I mean, I guess I take it from two different angles. So corporate America is soulless in many ways, right? And any soulless organization, community, family is incredibly difficult for the nervous system, for the body, for the soul to be embedded within. It's completely unhuman. It's back to exploited, objectified, where the soul is gone, the presencing is gone, and like the deliciousness, the lusciousness of life is gone, and it just becomes, you're just this cog in a wheel. So yes, so what happens in that type of system is you go through stages of you go through an instinctual trauma response. Your system goes into a, what the heck is going on here? It goes into a startle response. And often we're like, well, I just got to do my job. So I'm going to take my coffee. I'm going to, smoke my pot at night to just kind of keep going. And then the system, as you keep moving, keep going in that corporate system, it's like, this really feels like I'm a frog being boiled slowly. And there's going to be an internal protest that shows up, like a fight flight that gets impinged, like, no, I don't like this. But then the brain comes in and overrides it and says, but it's your job. You got to do it. You got to feed your family. You got to do this. So you keep smoking your cigarettes, taking your coffee, eating your donuts, whatever you got to do. And then the system will go, I really got to be in this. Well, then I'm going to shut down and go numb and disconnect and dissociate and be a walking zombie like everyone else. Right. And again, as I shared earlier, just like in the womb, when you move into more dissociative states, when you shut down and freeze and an aspect of the soul leaves, you become vulnerable of taking on that cultural influence, that cultural trance. Once there's a void, something comes in. And then you become part of the Borg. You're Borgified, if there's such a word, right? Part of the Borg. And so that's when you've got that automatic obedience, that compliance. So I'm kind of staring at myself or staring at the little pixels. Let me change that. So at least I'm staring at the video camera. So once that happens, you're in compliance. You're in this automatic obedience state. And then they got you. I mean, they got you by the, right?
By the balls.
Yeah. And so then after that happens, then we go into all these self-soothing, self-coping kind of strategies just to get by. Right? And there's many, many people that they just keep going throughout the whole life like this. So yeah, corporate, and in many ways, corporate America is designed very explicitly for people to move into dissociative states and go into those compliance automatic obedience states. That's what they're looking for. They do not want, well, I say this with a grain of salt. They often want people who are compliant, not committed. Okay? Because committed means having a voice, showing up, having your soul be there, saying no when there's something that isn't correct. You know, there's this ethical aspect that shows up. I do a lot of executive coaching, and I have to teach on the difference between compliance and commitment. And do they truly want a committed workforce, or do they want a compliant workforce? And that conversation has to be had on truly what do they want, and what are the risks of both? Because organizations aren't structurally set up for a committed workforce. And so this is what we have. So often what happens is people then go, I'm a boiled frog at this point, and I feel like I've just been assimilated into the Borg. And when they do leave these organizations, there is a complete like reorganization of the nervous system, and they do start to feel better. It's like, oh my God, I feel like I just woke up from a dream. So that does definitely happen. But I'm gonna put a caveat in there, and then Jane, I'll let you speak. You basically got me on my soapbox with this question.
Yeah.
I roll up my sleeves. We often will spend years in these organizations, and it's not until our like adrenals are shot, we're exhausted, our internal system is just fighting, that we wake up. But the question is, how did we get into these organizations in the first place? It's because they were familiar. Right? It's because in some ways they reminded us of our upbringing, of, for example, the womb traumas, the infant traumas, the developmental traumas. We were within families where it was very much a lot of exploitation or objectification or dismissal. You do what you're told. Much of, if we were raised in healthy homes, we would look at some of these corporate American organizations and hightail it the other way, but they're familiar. There's a reason why we're there. So in many ways, they're more of just a re-traumatization or almost a reenactment of prior wounds. And this is why you see some people they go from one job and they get relief by leaving it, but then they end up in another job that's kind of similar. It might be a little bit better, but it's because the system doesn't know how to truly see a healthy organization. All it knows is what it had in the past.
That was brilliant, Lisa.
Yes.
And
Yes, it was.
And just so everybody knows, Lisa's the one to talk about this because you spent how many years in corporate, right?
Yeah. Full lifetime.
And
I want to say I did my doctoral degree at DuPont Dow Chemical, and I studied engineers, and I took them through a bunch of processes. I won't go into the details, but you could just see it. I mean, people really deeply know it when they expose that truth. They know what's going on. Yeah. So, and their hearts break when they really wake up to it, and they feel stuck and trapped.
Yeah. So like Lisa, you have that background, which I do not. And I think it's interesting because, so I have a different slant on it, although it's exactly the same. although I never let myself get embroiled in that. Embroiled is the proper word here. I never allowed myself to get embroiled in that system. And because I, even though I dealt with enormous amount of addiction and had to get through it, I think there was always a part of me that knew that if I couldn't die in that manner. And so I never let myself go there. I preferred living on the edge in bankruptcy than to step into the system, because I think some part of me knew that if I stepped into the system that I would never get out. And so what Lisa, what you're talking about, and I think it's really important here, is what we're calling the trance. So the trance that we're born into, in the trance of compliance and the inability to know who we are, and we become cogs in the wheel, and that is part of the whole educational system. So really, if you really want to take it to the source, there's the trauma, that the fetus trauma, we're talking about conception, but it's going into every single, it's not just corporate, it's our educational system. So we're being raised as compliant consumers, right, to enter into the corporate system. And when people talk about waking up, and I think there's a reason why I never could do that, is because I had the spiritual awakening in my 20s, so it couldn't allow me to do that. But it's like, that's what waking up is. Waking up is waking up out of that trance. And when we wake up, whether it's through a psychedelic or just through a spiritual grace, right, then what happens is we become aware of the lack of awareness. We become aware of the system, and at that point, from that point on, we're really responsible for the choices that we make. I think that there's, at some point, if we're raised as unconscious, we don't really have much responsibility in terms of the decisions we make, because we really don't see that there is a different choice. But when we wake up and we begin to see that there is something else, even though we might not know what it is, but we know that the choices we've made are not in alignment with our soul purpose, and we continue to make those choices, then it's on us. It becomes our responsibility. There's nobody that's going to change it. And the reality is, and this is something that I'm very passionate about, and I came to learn from my own life and my own process. My own process taught me that every time I was up against a challenge and every time I was scared, I had two voices in my head, and it was up to me which voice I chose. So if I chose to go back to sleep, I would have a certain outcome. If I chose, despite the amount of fear that I felt for stepping into the unfamiliar, because it is always about the familiar versus the unfamiliar, and our beingness, our soul always takes us through the mystery and through the unfamiliar. But when we go into the unfamiliar, our subconscious, our nervous system will shut us down. It becomes so terrified that it will try to bring us back. And so we actually need to learn how to continue to follow the voice of the guidance system that is taking us to actual freedom and to actual soul purpose. There is that voice that's always there, and we can listen to it once we are aware of it. And if we don't, we're just going to repeat the cycle. I don't know how many lifetimes, or we're just, like, we get to repeat it over and over and over again until we get to a point where we make a different decision despite the amount of terror that brings up. And Lisa, you and I have talked about that. We've learned it in different psychological systems. So we were talking about it the other day when I was talking to you about the terror barrier. So every time that we're about ready to step out into something unfamiliar, which means stepping out of the familiar comfort zone, whenever we step out into that, we are guaranteed to meet the terror barrier. And the terror barrier it's devised by the ego system to get us to come back into its comfort zone. So if we're aware that we come up against a terror barrier and we don't choose to go back into comfort zone, every time we do that, we're going to step more and more further and further into our actual soul design and our freedom, our spiritual freedom. So every single one of us has the ability to step out of the cog wheel of the system and make other choices. It's just a matter of how much risk we're willing to take, because the reality is, from a spiritual perspective, is that there really is no risk. But of course, the ego doesn't know that. And so it feels like the whole world could come tumbling down and falling apart. And actually, Lisa, you could talk a little bit about that for the infant, because we learn that as infants, that what happens, that gets ingrained in us from infancy.
Yes, I actually want to talk about so can I come back that I want to touch on the terror piece for a second. So, okay, so I want to honor the complexity of this topic when we touch on sort of corporate America. So I'm going to kind of give my family as an example. So my grandfather worked for the railroad, and my dad was a bigwig in forestry, and then I showed up and I worked in oil and gas and computer science. And I remember coming into a place where I'm like, I can't do this anymore. I want to choose me and I want to choose my health. But anytime I said that, even anytime I felt that inside of me, I would move into such an extreme terror. I'd be on the ground, like I couldn't do it. And as I went deeper, I realized that wasn't just my voice. That was my father's voice. That was my father's father's voice. And that was my father's 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 voice. I had so many generations of choosing this exact theme over and over again that this wasn't just my life, right? I was having to push against generations. And it was so difficult to do that. I had so much cultural and so much family lineage inherited trauma wrapped around this, and inherited conditioning that said, no, you go to work. This is how you survive. This is how you keep your family alive. If you don't go to work, not only are you going to starve to death, not only are you going to be on the street, but you're going to put your family on the street. Like, there was such an extreme level of conditioning that was inside my DNA that it took me years to decouple from that. And even now, as I continue to move forward, I can still feel fragmentations as I'm like, I'm out of that. Why am I still? But that's what I'm saying is, like, it's just not us. It's just not womb. It's just not developmental. There can be inherited components to this, as well as cultural components that keep us impinged. So when we see ourselves, or we see our coworkers, or we see others really struggling, we want to kind of hold the space that they might not just be fighting their own demons. They might be fighting generations of inherited aspects that are ingrained within them. We just don't know how deep this goes. I mean, our whole system, the industrial age, right, is just how much of it is embedded within us. And I want to kind of touch on one to kind of hit home on this piece. So with inherited trauma, so they did a study with mice, and I think some of you might have heard this. So that study with mice, so they took male mice, and they brought a fragrance into their cage. And when that fragrance came to the cage, they shocked them. Until eventually a point was, they just bring the fragrance into the cage and their amygdala would go off, right? They wouldn't even need to shock them, right? Then those male mice had babies, and then they would bring the fragrance into the baby cages. They wouldn't shock them, but their amygdala would go off, right? Their fear response would go off. There was no shocking. They had inherited the trauma. And then those babies had babies, so 2 generations. And they brought the fragrance into the cage, and their amygdala, the fear response, would go off. So 2 generations down, they had a trauma response, the exact same trauma response as 2 generations prior. And that's what happens with this corporate America kind of trauma, as well as other traumas out there, is you've got one generation that is so trapped inside that system, that is terrified. And then that gets embedded within their eggs and their sperm, and then that gets passed down the generations.
Okay, so I was going to ask you to talk about the infancy. I think the piece, okay. So I have a little bit of a different viewpoint. I want to throw it out here. It's not that I'm disagreeing at all. I'm just adding a perspective, because I agree with everything that you just said, and I also want to add that the infant inside of us is terrified of not surviving. So every cell of our body is tribally oriented to mommy and daddy in order to survive until we're old enough to take care of ourselves. So that terror, regardless of where it comes from, so now this is the part I guess I wanted to add, my perspective is that it doesn't, in some way, it doesn't matter where it comes from, because it's going to be globally pervasive through every cell of our body and every part of our being. But there's another force that's as powerful, and that is the force of our higher mind. And so as we learn to recognize, as we learn to understand that when the fear comes up, when the terror comes up, it is an indication of our fear of survival, and is not an indication of truth. It's not an indication of that we're not meant to make a decision because of the fear. It's just an indication that something's been triggered in the physical somatic psyche of our bodies, the way we've been conditioned, that threatens that familiar mode of being. And the crucial piece in this whole process, and I'm going to come back to this, is the inner guidance system, and learning how to separate from the higher mind, which is the mind that is connected to the source and the truth of our being and our purpose for being here, and our conditioned egoic constitution, personality system. Every time we take a step out of the conditioned place, again, whether it's epigenetically, whether it's collectively, wherever, whether it's family, wherever it comes from, every time we step out of that, we're going to have a terror response. That's not the reason. If we continue to go back to what's safe, we will never continue on our path, the guiding system. And that's the key here. That's what I wanted to say. So I feel like a crucially important part of this is that, especially if we're using psychedelics or it's in our spiritual practice or whatever it is, we have to learn to distinguish, is this voice coming from the voice of soul and truth through me, guiding me, or is this voice a fear voice? And learn to make the distinction and to make a choice based on truth of how we're being guided. Now, with that said, we don't have the luxury to do that necessarily. I would suppose if we've gotten a job, right, in corporate America, and we have a family to raise, and we have to do what we have to do. So that's just part of our life and the decisions that we have to make. To know that there are certain situations that are going to make it impossible for us to actually follow the guidance of our soul because of previous decisions that we've put ourselves into. And because if we were to follow that guidance, that would cause a negative impact on our family or on the other people around us. So I think it's not an easy out. We have to think it through very carefully, but I think we also need to know why we're making the decisions we're making, and that we need to know that we have choice always, and that we're always making a decision.
Thank you both for that really amazing response to my question and to what you just said, Jane. Personally, for me, I know that the longer you're in it, the harder it is to get out of it. And it's much like a fish in water. Eventually it becomes to the point that you can't see that you're in it, just as a fish can't doesn't know that it's in water. And as you absorb more of what the trance culture puts on people, as you absorb that, much harder it becomes to break away from that. And your response to my question has sparked a lot of stuff in the chat, including Christina, and there are other things. We want to get back to Deb, who had another question too, which I think is really good. But Christina asked, what do you think about working for a large government organization? I'm feeling the same things you're describing in corporate America, and I've been in this organization for 15 years.
Jane, you want me to take that?
I mean, I don't know what the difference is. Maybe you can say what it is, Lisa. I don't know what the difference is. If you're in a system, you're in a system, whether it's the educational system, but go ahead. You probably know more than me about this arena.
So I think at the end of the day, kind of in my personal and my professional experience, is that it's about, again, the level of soul. So I've been in organizations, I don't know if you call them corporate America organizations, but consultative organizations where there's soul, where there's heart, where there's commitment and not compliance. And you can find that in mainstream organizations. In government, there's so much bureaucracy, there's so much standardization, so much procedure, so much paperwork, so much administration, so much governance and regulations, etc., that I think in many ways the soul is stripped out of it. It becomes so linear and so much bureaucracy that it becomes just another corporate America kind of sort of count. And it's about exploiting and objectifying, and the humanity is lost. And people begin to, fire emails back and forth without recognizing that there's a person on the other side. We lose touch, we lose the connection with the people, and they just become processes, and they become objects that are supposed to do what they're told. And you're supposed to do this, and it goes over there, and it goes over here. And when we lose that essence of humanity within the organization, when we lose the essence of the soul, the connection, the human heart, no matter where you are, then that's when our hearts die. That's when our souls die. That's when we feel like we're a cog in the wheel, that we're a frog that's being boiled. So it really doesn't matter if we're in government, corporate America, or just some small company. It's the soul has to be in it, embedded within the organization. And I've seen that happen within companies that are just mainstream companies. They're dedicated to that commitment, not compliance. I hope that answers the question.
Does. Thank you, Lisa. Jane, I see you looking through the chat too, and I have a question. I've got a couple questions. One that's relating to this directly is, how do we tell the difference between our soul voice and our frozen dissociative voice?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, that's a really good question. Do you want to start, Lisa, or should I?
I'm gonna have you do this one.
Okay. Okay, so the word that's coming in is aliveness, right? If you make a decision and it feels, if you hear a voice and when you repeat it or when you listen to it, you feel dull or numb or dead or bored, it's not the voice of your soul. If you hear a message and it brings light and joy and excitement and inspiration, that's the voice. That's the voice you want to listen to. I think it's pretty simple for me, but it's not, if we don't have the capacity yet to experience aliveness because we're so frozen, then my guess is that we're not going to be able to hear that voice yet. That's why I meant it's when I say wake up out of the trance, that's the experience. As we begin to feel some aliveness running through our body, we begin to have some creativity, we begin to feel some inspiration. some joyfulness. And even if it's just a little bit here and there, but that's the voice you follow. You always follow that voice. And then it gets tricky because as you follow that aliveness voice, that you begin to trust it more, because you see that when you follow that voice, good things come back, right? So you begin to trust it more, and then you have more courage to keep following that voice. And then that playing ground, that foundational of aliveness gets stronger and bigger, and then you have more capacity to keep following it. And at some point you recognize, and then while it starts out where, let's say, 98% is frozen, and you have a little 2% that's connected to that little bit of light and aliveness. And then slowly, as you work it starts to balance. And then at some point, the aliveness area of the life gets larger and bigger. But there are still those little pockets of numb, frozen places. And it's like the subtlety we need to become. And every time we take that step, it gets richer. It's like wherever, if you're in the coaching world at all, this word will be familiar, but the tolerations, like what are you tolerating in your life? That's the tolerations are the reflections of decisions that you've made out of numbness. When you're excited about, like when it's just like, yes, this is right, then you know that you're following that soul voice. And so one way to scan your life and look at where can I begin changing some of my decisions so I'm living more from soul and less from numbness, would be to look at what am I tolerating in my life, and ask yourself, what can I begin to do with this particular toleration? What can I do? What's my next step to open it up and brighten it up so that it's not just a toleration? And that's not that easy. And when you're just starting out, it's quite a project to do that. And it does get easier though.
Yeah, I'll add to what you're saying, Jane. So I like the words, what are we tolerating? I would say, what are our compulsions? What are our addictions? Right? Where are we acting out or acting in? Where are we in avoidance? And can we be soulfully observant to those ways and make a different choice? So are we spending hours every day on Facebook, on social media, on our phones, right? Are we drinking each night, or what are we doing? How are you spending your time? And if you're able to observe those impulses and observe those kind of behaviors and the thinking patterns and the ways in which you are numbing. So what is a numbing thought versus an alive thought? What is a thought of the soul versus a thought of numbness? Is follow your addictions, follow your compulsions, follow the ways in which numb you, and you'll figure out what those thoughts are. And so then it's like, okay, I'm going to hold back for 1 week on those things that numb me so I can create more space for aliveness to come in and to show me the way. And so it kind of comes back to what Jane was saying. The soul and the truth of the soul can't come in if you're numb. So create space by creating some boundaries around those numbing actions and behaviors and thinking patterns, so the soul and the aliveness can come in. And pay attention to your stinking thinking. Go ahead, Jane.
Yeah, but you're going to have to, but that's where you're going to meet your terror barrier. So every time you do that, so I mean, Lisa and I know this really, really well.
Well, you can titrate it, bit by bit.
Right. But I just wanted to bring to people's attention that once you start looking, every addiction or compulsion that we have is a way to numb out a terror that's underneath it. Mm-hmm. So really, or some deep pain, a feeling state, something that's very uncomfortable. And so when we I mean, Lisa's making it sound easy. I know for a fact it's not easy. I know Lisa knows for a fact it's not easy. So when we when we begin to choose to give up our addictions, what we most need to equip ourselves with is, one, we are absolutely going to step into discomfort. And that is where the aliveness is. So it's only through that discomfort that we do find the aliveness. So actually, that's the whole map that I use. And it's a very important one. It's when we give up the addictions, we step into the discomfort. And what most of us do, because we don't understand the processes, we run back out to the surface to the addictions. When really what you're wanting to do is step through that terror, that discomfort, and keep going until you find the center of the truth, that you have to go through that first. That's where the aliveness is. But like, we're making it sound very easy. That can take years to do that, depending on how locked in the addiction is, right?
Even just cutting back on, like, I mean, how many people are addicted to social media? You know, people are on it, like they say kids nowadays are on it 7 to 9 hours a day, which is crazy. So, you know, cut back to 1 hour a day and see what happens. See what happens.
Mm-hmm.
Do it for a week, a month.
And that answers the question that James has. You answered it just organically by talking about this. He says, does the choice enlarge you or keep you small? And I think that's what you just addressed.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's great. Yeah, as a way to weigh in on, yes. That's a good way, another good way to recognize that.
We had one question, and it's, do you feel complete on this subject? Okay. I wanted to go back to a question that I thought was great. It says, say more about the soul liking the grittiness of life.
Lisa, you do that one.
All right, I'll do it my way, Jane. You do it your way.
Okay.
Okay. So it's part of the cultural trance that, so we've been indoctrined into a cultural trance that suggests that we need to have the white picket fence, the perfect house with the perfect home, with the perfect partner, the perfect kids, right? Perfect education, enough money, perfect car, you know, like perfect body, perfect health. And it is all an illusion. It makes no sense. It's not how the soul grows. It's not how we grow. And it's this fantasy world that is an avoidance tactic of what's real and true. It's just pure avoidance of intimacy. And the soul loves intimacy. The soul loves to get in there and get its fingers wet and dig in the soul and find out what it unearths. That is how it grows. That's how it moves. That's how it spirals up and expands. If it tries to move into what society thinks is perfect and where it should move, it deadens the soul. The soul can't come alive in that. That's part of the lie, and that's part of the compulsions and addictions. It's an escapism. So the soul loves grittiness because it's in the grit, it's in the soil. That's the fertile soil. That's the manure to support your garden. How can you grow without the manure, without that grit? That you can't. So life's going to bring us as much grit and manure as it can to support the growth, right? And we know that. In the wild, like trauma, if we call it trauma, is a part of life. Animals have to be traumatized to build their resiliency, to build their adaptability so they can bounce back. It's a survival tactic. Right? So, and you see this in the wild. They know this. They know they're going to get hurt. They have the instincts to know how to bounce back from that. They know how to shake it off to support their resiliency, support their adaptability. And we've lost that. We've lost the grit of life. We've lost how to be in trauma and move through trauma in ways that support and facilitate our aliveness, as Jane puts it, our sense of embodied soul, our expansion, our sense of like, I can own myself, I can own my body, I can inhabit where I am and my surroundings because I've experienced life. But instead we tend to think that somehow perfectionism and the white picket fence is the way to go. And again, that's part of the trance that we get caught up in. Jane?
No, I don't have anything to add. That's great. I agree.
That was beautiful, Lisa. I love that. Should we go on to the next subject? Jane, you want to pick one or do you want me to?
I think we kind of, well, go ahead. You go ahead, Donna.
What do you think? And you know, we can move on. We don't, but I'm gonna just throw this out there. We kind of covered this a little bit, but why inherited and birth patterns are sacred and scary, and how not to become disoriented when doing this work. Did we?
I think we could say a little bit more on that. Maybe we have talked about it. I think the disorientation is an important part. We've been talking about the disorientation. There has to be disorientation, essentially. I mean, anytime that we're stepping out of a familiar pattern, there has to be disorientation. So when we say how to not become disoriented when doing this work, I'm trying to remember, Lisa, what were we thinking about when we wrote that? Because I know there was a sense of what we're talking about is the container, like to be sure that what we put into place, to be sure that there is enough of a safe container in place in order to step in. So every step of the way, it's like you can shock yourself into a new place, or you can be gentle with yourself as you step in and titrate step by step into a new place. And it's all going to be disorienting, but if we're careful with ourselves in terms of gentle and caring and compassionate, and we have built a foundation of resources. And we have a whole way of working with foundation. So Lisa and I both do this work where we're working very carefully with people to build a strong foundation of how to get back to center, how to get back to feeling grounded, how to access safety when I'm not feeling safe. And so there are many different ways we can do that. We can do that mentally, we can do that somatically, we can do that through our feeling states. And it's important as we're stepping into this new ground, as we begin to wake up, that we always come back to that place of groundedness and safety foundation. So it's step by step with safety, containment.
Oh, I'm going to add a story, Jane, to this. So I'm just going to share a story from my own life that may be relevant. So we're going to come back to the corporate America piece. So the statement was, why inherited and birth patterns are sacred and scary. I want to throw in something about the sacredness piece. So I do believe that, at least in my case, I'm here to not just clear kind of my own trauma, but begin to radically shift the lineage or the trajectory for my family. Right? And so I come from a corporate America kind of family, and very insidious sort of exploitation and objectification and embedded within the system. And I know that my father's trauma and my grandfather's trauma, etc., is very much about how they had to sacrifice themselves had to sacrifice so much of their soul to put food on the table. Sorry, making money and then putting food on the table. So then what, and what showed up is, because it went so against who they were, they then had addictions that showed up as compensation. And so anytime they try to stop the addictions, what would be in front of them is like, I'm stuck in a job that is killing me. And if I keep going with decoupling myself from these addictions, I don't know how to provide for my family. It would be a radical shift. And so this is an incredibly deep, painful kind of, what do you call it, inherited pattern within the system. And so the same thing happened for me when I started trying to cut out my addictions. I was faced with this corporate American job that was like, I don't know how I can be here. It was just intolerable. I took the addictions away. I was just a mess. And I could feel that, again, as I said before, it wasn't just me. That wasn't just my voice. This was a family lineage voice. And so I needed to honor the sacredness of this inherited trauma, that I was literally trying to transform the trajectory of my family and not repeat things that had been repeated generation after generation after generation after generation. And that process needs to be incredibly respected. It is a sacred process. There are your ancestors on the other side cheering you on like no tomorrow. They are just, and that needs to be honored. And so anytime you fall down, anytime you perceive yourself as failing, anytime you give up and move back into your addictions, is to as best as possible keep the berating to like a minimum level. It's like, oh, I'm so stupid. Why did I do that? It's like try to keep that out of your boundary and just recognize the work that you're doing, and recognize that this may not just be your trauma. This may not be just your lifetime. This could be work that is needed to be done for generations. And to have that humility and honor the process and the mistakes and the failures as you go forward.
Great.
Thank you, Lisa. So the next bullet point is, which is a great place to go next, how to best utilize psychedelics and plant medicine safely and legally for accessing these deep and unconscious cellular memories.
Well, we know if we're talking about cellular memories, we know we need to work deeply somatically. So that's going to be the first thing. So there are medicines that can take us deeper into a somatic, that can work more deeply with the somatic level. And there are other medicines that are going to take us more out of our body and into more dimensional places. So I think really if we're wanting to work on these particular cellular patterns, then we have to go into, as Lisa says, the nitty gritty, the muck of what's in the body. So it's a different choice of medicine. I mean, when you're working with muck in the body, I think, I have my preferences I know for me, which medicines are going to take me into the muck and which are going to take me out. And so I will make choices based on that. I also know that my intention has a lot to do with it. So how I set the journey up and what I intend to do in the journey is going to have a major big piece. I think that taking into account, if we're dealing with preverbal cellular trauma, we've got to take into account the need for touch, and so that touch is brought into our journey work, and it's done in a very clean, careful way in which it's usually sacred, so that there is no touch that that touch is only used with permission from both the touching and the not touching. So it's interesting because this touch can be tricky. So we can think, if we have a guide, for example, who's sitting with us and we're going into a deep cellular trauma, and we haven't yet dealt with our own touch issues, then as the guide or the therapist, we might, and we're following the westernized model, which of course as therapists, you're not supposed to touch anybody. So you're standing back and you're withholding. So for that person who's actually going through a very deep, let's say, infancy trauma, right? Then inadvertently we're re-traumatizing, even though we're doing what's the correct protocol in our culture. So working with touch, working with holding, working with the cellular system, working with maybe meridians, acupressure, just the ways of really working deeply in the body needs to be taken into account. That the very process of looking into the eyes. So I'm not going to go into the details. I don't feel like this is not the right place to go into the details of the correct protocol for bringing that kind of stuff into our journeys. But we really are talking about the relationship. So the relationship of the journeyer to the guide. That relationship is very sacred in and of itself. It's what makes the body feel safe. It what makes the container feel safe. It's what makes dealing with what comes up less scary and more sacred. So it's everything about that setting that we've established in the relationship specifically is what we're talking about. And that's where I feel like an enormous amount of prep work is needed to go into those deep places, those younger places. It's not something you don't get a guide and do a prep session and then go into that kind of work. This is where you really establish a relationship of trust for over time before you begin to go into those areas, so that they can be navigated very carefully. Because they're very fragile, those places.
Absolutely. Lisa?
I'm not sure what I would add. Maybe just watch out for how psychedelics and plant medicines can be used as a coping strategy to avoid some of these infant traumas. Taking too high a dose, taking the wrong medicine. Some medicines will dissociate you, and to really access these infant traumas, like Jane said, you want to get in the body, not out of the body. And like Jane said, we will pick the quote unquote wrong therapist to work with as an attempt at reenactment of our infant traumas. And so we want to be cautious of that as well, right? And so we will find a therapist and we're like, okay, this is going to work great. And we're not quite sure, like the plant medicine comes in, and then we end up with a therapist that might look at us if we go like, I'm feeling this draw to be able to touch you. And the therapist just looks at us like in stark terror. And that there's your reenactment cycle of maybe when you were an infant. Right? So you really want to do, you want to interview the therapist just as much as the therapist is going to assess you to see if you're a right fit. You want to make sure that the therapist is really understanding what attachment trauma is and these infant traumas are, and how to navigate that world. And as Jane said, can they do touch? Can they help you renegotiate and have the system kind of renegotiate what relationship truly means? When you're working through these stages, the system will, the good thing about plant medicine is it kind of strips away the ego defenses, as Jane's talking about, and it puts you in that kind of primary consciousness where the body just reenacts its old traumas, its old woundings. And so if you've got attachment trauma, it'll move through a push-pull. It'll like your system's gonna wanna reach out to the therapist, then pull back, reach out and pull back. It'll be like shaking and rocking as it's doing it. And then eventually, as it starts to make contact and it trusts that the connection is gonna be there, then you might feel as a client, sheer rage. Like that's what's underneath it, and a real sense of aggression. And you might wanna start kicking your therapist and raging. Right? That's part of the process. That's what's underneath those avoidance tendencies. And we have to negotiate that and work through that. So you want to make sure that you pick your therapist correctly, that they know how to navigate all of those stages of healing that those infantile kind of types of traumas.
And I'll just add to that as well that, touching might be the last stage. So you start working intimacy on all levels. So what does intimacy, how close can I let somebody come to me, even in space? And it's becoming really aware of what's happening in my body. So I will often start working with somebody. So the spatial distance in the room, but notice what happens right in your body as I come in closer. Then you get to say stop when you begin to tighten up. So you're always working with very careful listening to what's happening in the body, and it doesn't have to make any sense to the mind. There's not a right and wrong ever. There's just a listening and trusting that the body has a wisdom. And so as you're you're carefully working it. And that's why that you need to work over time. You need to build the trust between you and the person you're working with. If you're working on these issues, I mean, we're not talking about everything, but these particular issues have to be dealt with in a very careful way.
Yeah, and I love how you said it's a slow process. You're doing a lot of prep. You're not jumping into touching. So I have a question about therapy. Hold on one second, getting to it in the chat. Okay, so Seth asks, how do I interview a therapist for traumas I'm not fully aware of?
Well, there's going to be traumas that you're not aware of, because we're not aware of most of us are not aware of our conception traumas, our birth traumas. We're not aware of those, and we're not aware of a lot of things. So I'm not sure what the question is getting to.
I mean, if I understand the question is, yeah, as a client, you're not aware of. That's why you're going to a therapist, is to help you get that awareness. But it depends on where you're headed. So if you're looking at traumas you're not aware of, then my hunch is it's probably pre-verbal content, because that's usually the stuff that we're not aware of. Anything after the age of 5, we often have more cognitive memory around. So you want to find out, is the therapist or the person that your facilitator, do they have that background? What is their background when it comes to, as Jane puts it, the somatic realm? Because infant pre-verbal trauma is deeply in the bones and the tissues and the viscera. So is your therapist somatically trained? Are they attachment theory trained? What do they know about attachment? You might want to, before you go in and do this work, read a book on attachment theory. I love the book Raising a Secure Child. It's a book for parents, but I actually just give it to everyone because it speaks to us and how we were raised, and it helps us understand our strategies and where they came from and how we've attached. Right? It looks at things such as ambivalence, where you're like, yes, I want you, but I'm scared to reach for you. So that yes, no, or the anxious avoidant, where you're just dismissive and you're just avoidant of all relationships, and you self-soothe and you don't know how to reach to someone else and to be soothed, right? You get anxious in relationship, but you calm when you're away from the relationship. So raising a secure child, I like that book as a way to begin to understand your own attachment ways, and maybe how you parented if you have children. And then that can give you a template to then investigate or interview your therapist. Are they somatically trained? What do they know about attachment theory? And how do they go in? So that's the other piece. Are they just going to throw you into some sort of psychedelic experience and hope for the best? Are they going to do the pre-work? Are they going to do a trauma timeline? Are they going to help assess you? Are they going to actually do those pre-sessions to get you prepared? What are they going to do as post-integration sessions? What does it look like in the long term? Jane, anything you'd add there?
No, that was a really good job. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, you answered his question. He says, thank you. And I put the information about the book in the chat.
I guess I would add, okay, so then I would add the spiritual component. Because we're so somatic. So I would also just add to the questioning is, does the therapist or the person you're working with have access to spiritual world? Because whether it's, whether it's past lives or whether it's just source energy, but whatever it is, because what happens in the set and setting and with the psychedelic work is that the inner guidance system is only going to take us to what it feels safe in the setting. And if our guide is not aware, so whether it's somatically as well as dimensionally or spiritually, then there's only so much that we're going to be able to feel safe in accessing. Which is one of the reasons in my prep work, I do all of it. I want to make sure that before anybody does a journey, they are working on the somatic level, on the mental level, and on the spiritual level. And not because they should access things they're not yet ready for or able to access, but because I want them to open the door to that possibility. Because once the mind is able to conceive of a new concept, that means that concept can be allowed in. But if the mind is close to it and has no idea, it can easily go in and out, and we can't grab it and we can't work with it. And that's not absolutely 100%, because we can be given definitely with psychedelics, we'll be given new experiences, but unless we have a framework, a conceptual framework to utilize that experience, it won't take hold. It really won't take hold and get integrated into our life. So the setting, I like to make it, the prep work, as expansive and broad-based as possible, so that, because I can't know and our egos don't know. So the only part of us that truly knows is the inner guidance system, and the inner guidance system will take us to where we're ready to go. And if we don't have a conceptual framework, we won't go there. Once we have a conceptual framework, all of a sudden things will open up and we'll have access to new information and new resources internally. Because in some cases, I needed to access spiritual resources before I could go into the infant touch place. So we don't know exactly the order of things, but we want to know what's possible.
Yeah, and Jane, something you're mentioning in terms of the mental component is how I work with clients. Is I actually get them to do art processes that shift them into the right hemisphere on womb and pre-verbal trauma, where they begin to kind of, they have a sense, they know from their parents what their parents were like. They may not have a sense of the trauma itself, but they know their parents, they know what their parents was like, and we can piece together with just very little details, begin to track and chart and monitor what happened within the womb, right? Based on what we know, just the fragments of pieces that we know, and we can build what's called art narratives, graphic narratives, pictorial narratives of the womb experience. And then that fills the mind with insight and understanding and a conceptual framework. And then what it does is it almost opens up the body and to then release. And it helps us make more sense of what the body's doing in terms of some of its actions and its reenactment cycles. And so through art, we can begin to access some of these realms that aren't possible through just simply talking.
Well, and then to add to that, of course, we have movement, and we have micro movements. So anything that we can utilize to wake up some unconscious areas. And I know, Lisa, you work a lot with art, and in my whole life, I worked with movement and all forms of movement. So, yeah.
So, Seth had, let's see, another question. It says, you know, and I think you sort of touched on this earlier. He says, this all sounds vaguely familiar to what I seem to be very slowly stumbling towards, but the language is a bit different. I got myself off drugs, but still smoke weed and can't quite step into that fear enough to see other options.
It is a slow stumbling. So I have a question, I guess, let me just throw out a question for Seth. If you could imagine right now choosing not to smoke the weed, and like, what would you notice?
Anxiety.
Exactly. So there's your fear. It's an art to sit with anxiety or any discomfort. It takes practice. It takes the support of other to support and help you to know, to feel that you're safe sitting with that discomfort. So that's a big piece of it. So to replace the addiction, in this case, the smoking, right, would be to put another safety resource in place. And the question would be, what would that be for you? Because there's a number of different safety resources that you could utilize. But we think about every addiction is an attempt to feel safer, even though it's misguided and it turns on us. But every addiction is an attempt to get to safety. And so always when we're giving up one safety resource, we need to put a better one in place. And there are internal safety resources and there are external safety resources. So having an external safe other, I know for both Lisa and I can speak freely, I'm sure for both of us, we both had safe external safety people in our lives that helped us move through those challenging, very, very challenging, scary times. As well as we get back to that's very funny. Social media, that's very funny. Well, you know, it's not really that funny, and I'll tell you why. Because I went through a stage where I had to give up my eating disorder, and I replaced it with sitting. I mean, in those days, it was a little black and white TV. That's how, okay, I've just blurred my age. But I mean, I literally made the decision that I was going to come home from work, the little job I had, the little part-time job that I could tolerate. Instead of binging, I was going to sit in front of that TV, and it worked. It got me through that worst. And then slowly I was able to then let go of that. I think that's smart. Mm-hmm.
So there's, I'm going to add to what Jane's saying. So there's like two tracks, and we want to honor both tracks. So there is the replacement of the weed with other safety resources, right? And eventually my hunch is, again, if we were to do a bit of a trauma timeline and look at some of your family's lineage and family stories, my hunch is maybe weed is an attempt at self-regulation, and what the true piece in there that wants to come in is more collaborative or interactive regulation with another individual, another being. And for that process to happen, that's where Jane's talking about the terror. Like you said, you're touching on anxiety. That's where the terror and the annihilation fears come up, because potentially in the past, when you've tried to, for example, reach, or when anyone kind of with addictions, often there the trauma is in co-regulation. So when we've tried to reach in the past, it's been met with dismissal, it's been met with ambivalence, it's been met with kind of someone else's anxiety being pushed onto us, it's been met with perhaps abuse. And so we can't trust that interactive support with another. And so what needs to happen is building resources that you can trust that can replace it, and over time beginning to drop into that pit of fear and anxiety and terror, as Jane talks about it, and despair and whatever else is going on there, working that through so eventually you can heal it and support a new sort of collaborative interactive regulation to come through. That's really where we're at. So there's two trajectories. There's one, the resource piece, which is absolutely essential, and then dropping and then inhibiting. So really you want to inhibit all resources and drop into the depth of that terror and bring it through, work it through somatically so you can come out the other side. That's the duality of the process.
Mm-hmm. That was a great way to frame the two parts. I guess what I want to leave you with is there's really no growth without discomfort. The trance does that. The trance makes us think and believe that we should always be feeling good and happy, but the reality is there's no growth without that discomfort. No,
Absolutely.
we have to go through it. We have to go through it if we want to expand and grow.
Lisa and Jane, thank you so much. What a great discussion. And before we go, I want to let you each talk about your practices. And Jane, do you want to start?
I think I just want to let people know that actually we have, both Lisa and I have an upcoming course that's starting in June, which is a course that we just finished running. We're going to start it again in June. It's Developing Your Soul Seed. It is part of the program that I developed in Psyalchemy. And the purpose of this course is to provide a healing container for exactly everything that we've been talking this evening. We're not going to go into the depth of people's deep conception trauma in that course, but it is basically a community of individuals who are accessing, finding psychedelics as a way into healing. And it's a way of coming together in a safe, secure environment to do our healing work in relationship with each other. And the inspiration for this course, which I started last September, and then Lisa joined me this past cohort. And now we're going to do our third way through this. The inspiration came from the fact that I realized that healing doesn't happen without a healing tribe and without community. So that's the inspiration for that. And then that actually is the prerequisite for in September. We're going to be doing an advanced course, which will be specifically on this issue of soul embodied around intergenerational conception and wound in utero trauma. But we have to get this foundational piece down first. So that's what it starts in June, if any of you are interested in joining us.
And two, before you go, Lisa, I meant to do this, excuse me, a little bit earlier. I put in the chat the donation links and the survey link. We'd love to have your feedback. That's how we get better and better at this. And yeah, I'll hand it back to you, Lisa.
Oh, and if anybody, were we going to do that, Kazzrie? Were we going to have, if people want to be on our mailing list, can they add their email into the, how do you want to do that?
One awesome way to do that would be for them to fill out the survey and put their email there, and then we can get that to you. Or if you don't want to answer the survey questions, you could just put your email in there and we'll get it to Jane. That's a good way to do that.
Yeah. And that way you're just, if you're not moved to do something now, you might want to do something later, but we'll be able to contact you, keep you informed.
Yeah. And you can also go on Jane's site and add your emailing list and add your email and you'll get notified.
Oh, there's also, thank you for reminding me, because there's a free course. There's also a free course. You can go on that way. So you can put your email in and you can get access to the free course on models of transformation that I started from last time. Yeah, and Soul Embodied. We have the free course on both. So the free course goes a little bit more in depth in terms of what, and I don't really know if it goes that much more in depth than what we've just done tonight, because we've done a lot, but it's done more sequentially, so you can actually look at and work with something small.
And I know a lot of counseling and coaching is over Zoom. So Lisa, do you want to give some information, because anybody here can reach you and use your services?
Yeah, I do. I'll work through telehealth, which is a secure. It's Zoom, but it's more secure. And so I work with people all over the country, globe. And I do, basically, I mostly focus on, I use art and I use the somatic realm. And we do tend to focus on womb trauma, preverbal trauma, and all other traumas. That tends to be what we work on, along with IFS and any sort of integration work that needs to happen for some of your psychedelic experiences. Yeah, I'm not quite sure what else I want to, if anything I'm missing on that. And if you have any questions, you always can ask me.
Right, and your website and email are in the chat, so Lisa and Jane can be reached.
My website for my individual work is down, but you can go to my other websites as well. So I work with couples, and that's embodylove.com. And I also do leadership, executive leadership, corporate stuff, and that's embodyleadership.com. I have another website called embodychange.com, but it's been down for a while and I haven't gotten to fixing it, which is the work I do with trauma.
Right, and those both of those websites are in the chat.
And Amy, the free course and the paid course are all on my website. And if you can't find them, just contact me directly and I'll give you the links.
On behalf of PPS, I want to thank both of you for an amazing session. And for everyone here who's joined us for this, this is pitch time. This, as you can see, is an amazing thing, and we need your help to continue so we can bring more of these to you. So I'm sounding like a PBS record here, but if you've got some spare change, that's great. And if you don't, please take the time to fill out the survey, because that helps also tremendously. Thank you, everybody, for coming.